Alright, so we're on to 2.6, which is rules for multiplication. We talked about earlier rules for addition. You're going to hear some familiar names, but it's going to be slightly different, obviously, because it's geared towards multiplication. Now, first off, for all following properties, A and B are real numbers, so keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to first start with the identity property of multiplication. If you recall, when we did the identity property of addition, we basically said when you add 0, it's always going to stay the same. Well, in this case, it's not going to be multiplied by 0, it's actually going to be multiplied by 1, because if we start with A, and if we multiply it by 1, that will ensure us that we keep A just the way it is, by multiplying by 1. Or you could do 1 times A, and it's still going to equal A. So we have an example, 5x times 1, it's going to stay the same, it's going to, it's its identity, it's the same thing, so it's going to be 5x. Okay, so that's simple enough. Next one is the multiplication property of 0. Again, you might actually hear the book call it, or me call it, multiplicative property of 0. Same thing, same idea. So here, that's something that I said and did not write down, so make sure you know what I mean. Okay, so multiplicative property of 0, multiplication property of 0 basically states that if you take A as your number and you multiply it by 0, you're going to get 0 regardless, because anything, we know that. Anything times 0 is 0. This is something you already kind of know, but it has an actual title. Or you could say 0 times A, it's still going to equal 0. So our example, 0 times 8y, that's going to be 0. And moving right along, we're going to have another one very similar to the multiplication property of 0. It's the multiplication property of -1. Again, it could be referenced as the multiplicative property of -1. And if you can kind of infer from what we used before, we had a multiplying by 0. Well, this time we're multiplying it by a -1. So if we multiply it by -1, it's going to stay the same in the sense of it's still going to be A, but you're going to have that negative in front of it. So, or we could do -1 times A, and that will give us a -A. So it's basically like the opposite of it. And so if we get our -1 times 6A, that will give us a -6A. Now we're getting to the property of opposites in products. And we know products are the answer to a multiplication problem, hence rules of multiplication. We know what opposites are, like 5 and -5, so on and so forth. But now we kind of have the opposites in products, and that's kind of having to do with the negative sign. So if we have -A times B, that will give us a -AB. Likewise, if we have a positive A and a negative B, then that will still give us a -AB, because again, the negative can go in the front. Now, if we have a -A times a -B, that will give us a positive AB. And if we give the example, again, the two negatives cancel each other out, then we multiply 5 times 6, which is 30, and then we have that X right there. So here's some more rules for multiplication. If two numbers have the same sign, then their product is positive. For example, 5 times 3, they're both positive, it's going to equal a positive 15. We could also have, if we had two negatives, so -2 times a -7, well, those negatives cancel each other out, so 2 times 7 is 14, so it's positive. So if they're the same sign, when you multiply, it's going to be positive. Now, if the two numbers have different signs, their product is negative. Okay, because one of them is going to be negative and one of them is going to be positive. So therefore, we had -3 times 4 Well, we know that there's only one negative, so it has to be negative, and then 3 times 4 is 12. And then, okay, the product of an even number of negative numbers is positive. What I mean by that, if you were to multiply two numbers and they're both negative, you're going to end up with a positive because a negative times a negative is a positive. Now, if you have 4, the two of them will each pair up to make them positive, and then a positive times a positive is a positive. So that's why if you have an even number of negative numbers, the negatives are going to cancel out. For example, if we have negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 2 times negative 2, well, we know that negative 2 times 3 is 6, and negative 2 times 2 is 4, so we end up getting 6 times 4, which is 24. You see, a positive number. So you can just kind of see how they cancel each other out, so you don't have to pay as much attention. You can just be like, okay, I know it's going to be positive, so I can just forget the negatives from now. Likewise, the product of an odd number of negative numbers is negative. Obviously, if you have 3 of them, that's going to be a negative times a negative, which makes it positive, but times another negative makes it a negative. So if you were to have, again, negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 5, well, if I multiply these two together, that gives me a positive 6. So now I have 6 times a negative 5, which gives me a negative 30. Okay, so again, you could do it like separately like that, or you can just think, oh, I know it's negative because there's 3 of them, 3 negative signs, and only 2 of them cancel out. So then I can just go 2 times 3 is 6, times 5 is 30, and then know that it's negative. Now, so if there's only one negative there, I know my answer is going to be negative. Then I can multiply the 3 times 7, which is 21, and then I have my x and my y. And make sure you distribute the negative 3 to the 6 first, so then we get negative 18 because we have only one negative. And then we have to distribute it to the negative 8y. So the negatives cancel out to make it positive. And 3 times 8 is 24, and we're left with that y. This is as much as you can possibly simplify this, because I cannot combine any more without knowing why. So there you have it. Hopefully this was a big review for a bunch of people, because hopefully you already know some of these properties or know these rules. We're just kind of reinforcing it and something to remind you.